Fast forward to a time overshadowed by World War II, a time when the very soul of America was tested. Yet, amidst the chaos, an unlikely story unfolded on the gridiron, the 1942 college football season. This wasn't your typical year. Join us on this podcast adventure as we delve into the season like no other. The war, the players, the coaches, the innovation, rules, revisions, and more coming up in 1942 in just a moment.
This is the Pigskin Daily History Dispatch, a podcast that covers the anniversaries of American football events throughout history. Your host, Darren Hayes, is podcasting from America's North Shore to bring you the memories of the gridiron, one day at a time.
Hello, my football friends. This is Darren Hayes of PigskinDispatch.com. Welcome once again to the Pigpen, your portal to positive football history, and our football history rewind college football season 1942, the definitive history of the 1942 college football season. Now, imagine a time when the military training camps fielded powerhouse teams stepping onto the field alongside established college football programs. A time when the nation was at war and it clung to normalcy and a competitive spirit offered by Saturday afternoon games. We'll explore the unique circumstances that shaped this unforgettable season, from the rise of military teams to the legendary players and coaches that suited up and entered the field on those Saturday afternoons that were all important to the nation and its normalcy. And we'll get to that in just a moment. But before we do, let's hit the subscribe button right down below to make sure you don't miss any of our podcasts and video blogs and vlogs that are coming out on YouTube and your favorite podcast provider, and as well as pigskindispatch.com. So buckle up, sports fans. We're going to get ready for this great and inspirational 1942 season. As we said, it's one of the most memorable seasons to date, and it's impactful in history due to some of the unique circumstances of the country at war, military teams elevated to powerhouses, and several teams vying for the national championship title, as we'll see in a moment. We will delve into the football in Georgia, Oklahoma, Ohio, Wisconsin, and Iowa as we uncover the people, games that made this a famous and very unique football season indeed. Now, we had a problem. And we noted it was the end of the 1941 season that Pearl Harbor was bombed by the Japanese, which triggered war declarations by FDR, our president at the time, of putting the two theaters of war for the United States. And it drew from our college-age men that needed to serve in that military service. Most of them willingly, some by the selective service draft, and others were enlisted and already part of the military as tensions had grown throughout the world. Now, these were brave men. It's a generation like no other where service to their country and to the world and the world causes of good were very much going on full strength. Now, rations on common supplies such as gasoline and preventative nighttime blackouts for fear of bombings, restricted travel, and night games when they could be played. Now, opponents were more localized than normal, and however, some areas saw new teams to face in light of the military training schools and bases that were flooded with recruits looking for some pastime and some training. And football was such a great training device to keep people in shape, and the military really appreciates a good football team, that's for sure. Now, the collegiate brain trust of the NCAA, along with the coaches and administrators, had their hands full. No one, including the federal government and military, wanted football suspended for this great and dynamic war, as it was a pleasant distraction from the horrors that the world was facing in light of the tragedy and the Holocaust and Nazi Germany and Italy and their horrible dictator that was doing horrible things to their people and the people surrounding, and the Japanese, what they were doing to Southeast Asia and Asia expanded. It was just some terrible things. Now, the challenges that faced this game were minor in comparison to what was occurring on the global stage. The consequences were that the 1942 season seemed to be in trouble in that late fall. Now, innovation to the rules revisions were deployed by the rules makers to help soften the sting of the manpower issues due to the selective service draft, as the freshman eligibility rule was waived. So for the first time in history, except maybe World War I, there was a few instances there, freshmen were allowed to play varsity football. Now today that happens all the time. We think nothing of it. But up until that point of World War II, freshmen had to play on a freshman team, and that was it. They were not eligible for varsity play. So you really only had 3 years of eligible playing time as a college, as a normal time. There were some exceptions, wartime and other instances helped to do that. Now, free substitution was also being allowed at the end of the 1941 season, with players permitted to substitute at any time, but not to be withdrawn or an outgoing player returned until at least one play had commenced. That sort of established our rule we have today. You can't have a substitute today come onto the field and no play go off unless there's a timeout, officials or team timeout. But a player can't come on and go back off. That's called illegal substitution, and that's a 5-yard penalty, dead ball foul. Now, there were programs, though, that arose from these problems that issued in the world. Like some colleges like Texas A&M and Iowa saw an influx of available players due to the military training programs established on their campuses. Iowa, well, that's a little bit of a different circumstance to Texas A&M. They had it part of their enrollment as being military because they always did a little bit of military training, even non-war times. Now, October 31st of that season, Wisconsin Badgers hosted the Buckeyes of Ohio State in a Big Ten matchup that was all important, not only to the conference of the Big Ten, but to college football in general. Former Notre Dame Four Horsemen back Harry Struderer was in his 7th year as Wisconsin's head coach for that game. Wisconsin had 5 wins, 0 losses, 1 tie going into that Halloween Eve or Halloween day game against Ohio State. And the Badgers' only setback was a week 2 tie against Notre Dame when they tied 7-7. Now, Coach Paul Brown was in his 2nd season at the helm of Ohio State, and the system that he used in a successful high school coaching career at Massillon High in Massillon, Ohio, had been practiced well by his players in the previous year's adjustment period. They were buying in, drinking that Kool-Aid that Paul Brown was selling, and they had a very strong program. The Buckeyes were undefeated thus far in the season, knocking off the likes of Fort Knox, Indiana, USC, Purdue, and Northwestern. Trouble set in, though, as during the train ride to Madison to play the Badgers, a good portion of the Ohio State players, about half of them, contracted an intestinal disorder, some stomach issues, a stomach flu, after drinking from an unsanitary drinking fountain. So maybe a touch of food poisoning on the train from some stagnant water. Remember, not the same hygienic processes that we practice today. Those trains, that water could have been sitting there for a long time and germs all over it, and just didn't have the know-how and the scientific background and the studies that we have now to know these things. Depleted in their ranks, the Buckeyes could not fend off the strong play of the Badgers, falling 7-17 for their first setback of the year to their hosts. And this was the only loss for Paul Brown's team as they went the rest of the season without a blemish, taking on worthy opposition after Wisconsin's loss. They played Pitt, Illinois, Michigan, and Iowa Pre-Flight, who we will talk about in just a moment. Perhaps still on a euphoric high after the win over the rivals, the Badgers also suffered their first setback a week later when they traveled to Iowa, and the Hawkeyes dashed the happiness of the Wisconsin faithful with a 7-0 victory over the Badgers and gave the Badgers their only loss. Now, in the crucible of World War II, an unlikely gridiron force emerged. The 1942 Iowa Pre-Flight Seahawks, representing the Navy's Aviation Training School at the University of Iowa. The Seahawks football team was coached by Mississippi State, Tulane, and Minnesota former coach Bernie Bierman, who soared to a 7-3 record in 1942, outscoring opponents by the commanding 211-121 difference. Their losses were to Notre Dame, Ohio State, and Missouri, who were dampened by big wins over the Kansas, Michigan, Minnesota, Northwestern, and Nebraska earlier in the season. And that Ohio State and Missouri losses were their last 2 games of the season. We talked about the Ohio State one a little bit, Missouri in December. In 1942 and 1943, Great Lakes Blue Jackets football teams were coached by the former Butler University coach, Tony Hinkle. And Great Lakes went on to some great things with some excellent college players. As a matter of fact, Paul Brown at Ohio State, who we'll talk about more here in a second, he ended up going to the Great Lakes team a few years later, 1944, 1945, and brought along some players there and developed into the Cleveland Browns team that Brown put them on, Marion Motley and others, just to be exact on that. But Paul Brown, in his year with Ohio State, had played against a very strong opposition and a quarterback named Otto Graham that played for Northwestern, and he brought him from Northwestern to the Cleveland Browns 1946 in the AAFC's first year. We'll get more into that in a future broadcast, and we've already covered on some other ones. Another military team that arose in 1942 was the 2nd Air Force Bombers team that won the 1943 Sun Bowl that year. They were very formidable. And there was about 2 or 3 dozen different military football teams that competed on the collegiate level that year. Some good, some not so good. Fort Knox was one that we're going to talk about a few times here, playing some opponents in college football that made a difference. But the big teams in this year was Ohio State's Buckeyes. They were the Big Ten champions, even though that loss to Wisconsin. The Iowa defeat of Wisconsin a week later ended up putting the Buckeyes as a 9-1 record, ranked number 1 in the final AP poll. They go on to be ranked as national champions. So Paul Brown wins a national championship at the high school level, an Ohio State championship with Massillon, wins a collegiate championship with the Ohio State Buckeyes, and multiple professional championships, both 4 of them in the AAFC and I believe 3 more in the National Football League for his Cleveland Browns team. So very successful at all levels for Paul Brown. We have quite a bit of tape and podcast episodes dedicated to Paul Brown. You can listen in on one of those and you'll get a lot of information from the experts that come in and talk about him. The Georgia Bulldogs were also a powerhouse that year. There were times during the season where they were ranked number 1 in the AP poll over Ohio State. The SEC champions had an 11-1 record, ranked number 2 in the final AP poll, later voted national champions by some selectors. But a late season November 21st loss to rival Auburn took Georgia from the unbeaten ranks, sort of knocked them down in the polls, let Ohio State surge ahead of them after the loss to Wisconsin, and it caused uncertainty of the top team in the nation that year. So some folks are still battling over Ohio State or Georgia. The Wisconsin Badgers only had 1 loss, 8-1-1 record, Big Ten runners-up, ranked number 3 in the final AP poll, selected as the national champions by the Helms Athletic Foundation. So there are some reasons to believe that's by some that Wisconsin should be the top team retroactively. The Tulsa Golden Hurricane were the Missouri Valley Conference champions, MVS. They went 10-1, and they were ranked number 4 in the final AP poll. The Golden Hurricane had an undefeated regular season, but fell 7-14 on New Year's Day's Sugar Bowl against Tennessee. The Vols double up the score there on the Golden Hurricane, take them out of contention for being declared the national champions. Georgia Tech, also very strong in the South. The Yellow Jackets were the SEC runners-up with a 9-2 record, ranked number 5 in the final AP poll. Their only 2 setbacks of the season were in their final 2 games. On November 28th, 34-0 drubbing by the Georgia Bulldogs, followed by a New Year's Day 7-14 loss to the Texas Longhorns in the Cotton Bowl. So 2 powerhouse teams knocked them off final weeks of the season. Now, the Georgia Bulldogs and the UCLA Bruins tangled into 29th Rose Bowl game on January 1st, 1943 in Pasadena, California. Scoreless through the first 3 quarters, Georgia put up 9 unanswered points in the final period as Willard Red Boyd blocked a Bob Waterfield punt out of bounds for an automatic safety for the first 2, and then Georgia's Frank Sinkwich dove in from the 1-yard line for a touchdown, and Leo Costa converted the PAT. The Bulldogs won it 9-0, and Georgia's Charlie Trippi was retroactively named the player of the game when the award was created in 1953. Now, In conclusion, the 1942 college football season is significant in history as its resilience shown by its players and teams during a challenging time still provided for a very competitive and entertaining product on the field. Now, some of the awards that went to individuals. Frank Sinkwich of Georgia won the Heisman Trophy, becoming the first player to surpass 2,000 yards of total offense in just one season. Other players with statistical leaders included Paul Governale of Columbia, who won the Maxwell Award. Rudy Mobley of Hardin-Simmons with 1,281 rushing yards was the leading rusher in the nation. Leading passer with 1,117 yards was Ray Evans of Kansas. Harding Miller of SMU had 531 receiving yards, top receiver in the country. And Bob Stuber of Missouri scored 121 points, more than any other player in the United States in college football for 1942 season. And that is what we have for your 1942 football history rewind. And boy, was that fun flashing back and looking at these great players and teams from that season when the nation was at war and the world was at war. We encourage viewers to watch more of our videos and listen to our podcasts and read on Pigskin Dispatch. We have the YouTube channel, Pigskin Dispatch, and we have our podcast is the Pigskin Dispatch podcast, and pigskindispatch.com for all your latest and greatest football history. We really enjoy talking with you today. Hope you enjoyed it and want to invite you back for some more great history. Until then, have a great Gridiron day. Peeking up at the clock, the time's running down. We're going to go into victory formation, take a knee, and let this baby run out. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you back tomorrow for the next podcast. We invite you to check out our website, pigskindispatch.com, not only to see the daily football history, but to experience positive football with our many articles on the good people of the game, as well as our own football comic strip, Cleat Marks Comics. Pigskindispatch.com is also on social media outlets, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and don't forget the Pigskin Dispatch YouTube channel to get all of your positive football news and history. Special thanks to the talents of Mike and Jean Monroe, as well as Jason Neff for letting us use their music during our podcast.
This podcast is part of the Sports History Network, your headquarters for the yesteryear of your favorite sport. You can learn more at sportshistorynetwork.com.